DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests today are, well, Democracy Now! Co-host Juan González and Joe Torres. They've just completed a masterpiece, News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media. This begins their tour around the country as they speak in New York, in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, in New Mexico, in Colorado, and Washington, D.C., to tell the story of race as a central theme in the development of the U.S. media. Now, that song you were just listening to was not just any song. Juan, not that you're related, but can you talk about who Pedro González was?
Well, Pedro González was one of those unsung heroes of American media and journalism. He was a radio host, a singer, actually. That was originally a telegraph operator in Mexico who then came to the United States and became a radio host in the 1930s in Los Angeles. And he had a morning show, Los Madrugadores, where basically he was talking to and playing songs for the migrant workers who were working in the fields early in the morning. And in the 1930s, President Herbert Hoover instituted a mass deportation program to ship Mexican immigrants back to Mexico. It was at the height of the Depression, and the media was stirring up, just as they are now, anti-immigrant fervor. And so there was a massive deportation program where about 1 million Mexicans were shipped back to Mexico. And Pedro González was one of the few radio announcers in those days who was constantly condemning these raids, these immigration raids and deportations on his radio station. He was suddenly arrested by the Los Angeles district attorney and charged with on a fabricated rape charge and sentenced to San Quentin prison, where in 1939 he actually organized a hunger strike of the inmates of San Quentin against conditions in the prison system. Sounds very modern, doesn't it, in terms of his activities. Eventually, it turned out that his accuser recanted and admitted that she had been put up to the charges by authorities, and Pedro González was released from prison, but immediately deported to Mexico, where he ended up in Tijuana for many years as a radio announcer. Eventually came back to the United States, where he died here at the age of 99 several years ago. But he was one of these early heroes who used his media platform to try to stand against injustice for immigrant workers. But he's virtually unknown. I mean, there was a PBS documentary that was done on him several years ago, but largely in most media histories, you never hear about him. Some of the songs that you're playing are from one of his albums, because, as I said, he was a popular singer of his day. And there were actually corridos, ballads written about the injustices of the jailing of Pedro González in the 1930s.
Go back to colonial times, the first newspaper in the United States, its significance, and then take us forward.
Well, see, this is what people don't know. It's true that African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans were not employed by the media until really in large numbers till the 1970s. But race has always been a major topic of the American media from the start. And we went back to the first newspaper in North America, Public Occurrences, in 1690 in Boston. It was a 3-page sheet, and the first newspaper, and it was suppressed by the Massachusetts Council after one issue because it had some provocative articles in it. But when you read the first newspaper, you realize that the bulk of the content, 5 articles in that newspaper, is intelligence to the settlers about what the Native Americans are up to. Basically, to quote the Benjamin Harris, who was the editor and publisher of the paper, he says at one point that when he's talking about the Mohawks and the battles of the Massachusetts colony with the Canadian settlers. He says, if Almighty God will have Canada to be subdued without the assistance of those miserable savages, we shall be glad. And all of the articles were about the threats of Native Americans, except there was one positive article, and that was about how some Christianized Indians in Plymouth were giving thanks to God on Thanksgiving. But generally, and so public occurrences set the prototype for how race would be covered in America, because every newspaper subsequent to that, throughout the colonial period, a huge portion of the content of newspapers was for the settlers to know what the Indians were up to.
And then we can go to the quote in Joe and Juan's book from the New York Tribune editor and publisher Horace Greeley. In an 1854 account of his trip to the western frontier, Greeley wrote, "I have learned to appreciate the dislike, aversion, contempt wherewith Indians are usually regarded by their white neighbors and have been since the days of the Puritans."
Yes, well, interestingly, Greeley was well known in the 19th century as one who was opposed to slavery. He was a publisher who constantly railed against slavery. But when it came to Native Americans and when it came to the Chinese immigrants, he was incredibly racist in the kind of coverage that his paper, which was the New York Times of its day, the Tribune in the mid and late 19th century was the paper of record in the United States. And Greeley was amazingly racist toward Native Americans and toward the Chinese, while at the same time advocating abolition of slavery.
On the issue of Native Americans, Joe Torres, can you talk about Ora Edelman Reed, known as the Sunshine Lady?
Sure. She's her family mother owned a newspaper in Oklahoma, and she ended up taking over the business and running a magazine called Twin Territories, which really became the a place where Native American literature really thrived. And she went on in Casper, Wyoming, to the station 1924 to really be the first Native American to be a broadcaster, and it just shows that it is an example how early on how there were several people, there were several journalists of color who actually worked in the mainstream. Her mother owned, and her sister and they worked in the mainstream press. And it's a few examples, not too many, but there are a few examples, 100, 150 years ago where people of color actually worked in the mainstream press, and she's a prime example.
Well, another example that totally unknown, John Rollins Ridge, a Cherokee Indian writer, novelist, wrote a novel about Joaquin Murrieta, the California so-called bandit. But John Rollins Ridge ended up moving to California and founding the Sacramento Bee. And being the first editor and publisher of the Sacramento Bee. Now, he eventually sold the paper to James McClatchy, one of his employees. And of course, McClatchy developed the Sacramento Bee into the flagship newspaper of the McClatchy newspaper chain. You go to the McClatchy history on their website, or their official history, there's no mention that a Cherokee Indian was the founder of their flagship paper. They make it seem like James McClatchy actually started the Bee. But it's this kind of expunging of the actual history of African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans in the development of the American press. That is what really, another major theme of our book is to resurrect that history and have a more inclusive history of how our press developed. That there were all kinds of folks who played pivotal roles and actually heroic roles in the development of a free press in America that have been expunged from the official histories.
Joe Torres.
Yeah, man, what was interesting about the book is that Juan talked about the public occurrence, and here you had a positive story about Native Americans who were actually fighting with the white settlers on the same side. We have another story in the book where there's a Seminole woman who came to the aid of a white settler, a teenage woman, and saved a white settler's life. We have, when we were at NHJ, we had a study, a Brownout study, showed that really the only positive coverage of immigrants to this day is when they fought in the military. And so it's like a theme that it has been constant for 400 years when we're fighting alongside the settler or here in the U.S. military, and we found that in the Brownout reports. That's really the few times where you actually see a positive portrayal of people of color, and that is a constant theme. And also too, the issue of expansion. These papers really were writing about, very supportive of U.S. expansion, and it's a theme that still plays out today. With the War and Peace report and everything, and how the U.S. media really is very supportive of military operations And that is a theme that continues to play out to this day.
And I think also the role that is rarely acknowledged of the press by people of color of being anti-war and anti-imperialist. And one of my favorites is Frederick Douglass, who not only was the editor of several African-American newspapers throughout his lifetime, but who was also one of the most vocal opponents of the U.S. war against Mexico, and was constantly in his papers railing against it. I just want to quote one article that appeared in one of Douglass's papers. This is 18 months into the Mexican-American War. And he says, "We have seen for 18 months the work of mutilation, crime, and death go on, each advancing step sunk deeper in human gore. By every mail has come some new deed of violence. Cities have been attacked, and the cry of helpless women and children has risen amid the shrieks and agony of death and dishonor. The living have gone forth, and dead corpses encased in lead have returned. Thousands of widows and orphans have been sent up to the heavens. Have sent up to the heavens the pitiful wail. And yet all is quiet, as under the most perfect despotism. There is no united appeal which would make the rulers tremble, no thronging voices of petition, no indignant rebuke, no prayer, Lord, how long?" He was basically chastising the rest of the press and the leaders of the country, the silence over the continuing slaughter that was occurring in Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War, which, of course, was a war that sharply increased the size of the United States by all the territories that were taken after the U.S. victory.
And, of course, Frederick Douglass owned his own paper. Tell the story of who Frederick Douglass was, his significance. I mean, the most famous abolitionist in the United States, born a slave. But from there, why he chose the media as his form of liberation.
Well, he was an amazing, anyone who's read any of the works of Frederick Douglass knows what an incredible writer he was. But he was an escaped slave and actually was hidden away when he arrived in New York by another journalist, David Ruggles, who was the editor of the Mirror of Liberty, and Ruggles not only was an editor of a newspaper, he was always constantly hiding fugitive slaves in New York from the slave catchers, and Douglass was one of the people who Ruggles saved, and Douglass then went on to edit several newspapers and became a close friend of William Lloyd Garrison, obviously, who published The Liberator as well. But Douglass was incredible in not only in his opposition to imperialist war, but in his championing the rights of women. He had many women writing for his newspaper. He was always advocating the equality of women. So he was far ahead of his time on many issues. One of the really great journalists of the 20th century, of the 19th century, but then again, except in the African-American community, he's rarely talked about as the critical figure that he was.
So what's really incredible about everything Juan is saying is the fact that there were African-Americans and people of color actually writing stuff and were brave enough to actually put word to print in a time of oppressive discrimination in our country. And it goes to the point that Juan made when he began the discussion about centralization versus decentralization. The reason these guys were able to put out papers because the U.S. postal system was a decentralized system. The delivery of mail was heavily subsidized, where it made it easy. Basically, the postal system was the delivery of newspapers, but it allowed, because it was decentralized, African Americans, people of color, and Native Americans, Latinos, the first Latino Spanish language newspaper, 1808, to distribute newspapers, and that's why we argue to this very day that decentralization is really what's critical that would allow us to be able to tell our stories, whether it goes from radio, television, and now the internet. So I think that is the primary lesson that these guys were able to even exist at the time because of postal policy.
And that was a result, because I mentioned earlier the seminal debates. The first seminal debate in American history over the media was the debate over the creation of the post office in 1792 in Congress, where different leaders among the founders of the country had different viewpoints, because the post office Jefferson, Washington were in favor of the government delivering newspapers to the people for free. Madison and others were saying, no, let's do it at market rate, whatever it costs to deliver them. Because understand the importance of newspapers in America. Printers and editors were critical to the American Revolution. Without the editors and printers who got involved in spreading the word of opposition to England, it's conceivable that the revolution would not have developed as quickly as it did. So the printers then played a critical role, several of them, in the founding of the country, and then they pressed for a postal system that would deliver papers. Because remember, the United States was a country that had a territory that was settled. The people lived far apart in their farms all around the country. News and information for a new country was critical in keeping the country together. So that's why Washington and Jefferson favored free delivery of newspapers. And the postal system became the first internet, really. Wherever there was a settlement, there was a post office. And the government built a road, a postal road, to get to that post office and deliver the mail. But 90% of the mail was not letters. It was newspapers.
Didn't the post office at first refuse to mail abolitionist newspapers?
Well, yeah, but that came later as the battle over slavery occurred. But when the founders created the postal system, a requirement was that it had to deliver all mail, and also that eventually the compromise that they reached was the creation of a second-class postal system, where basically papers were delivered at subsidized cost, so that you had a situation where the United States quickly developed the most newspapers per capita of any country in the world. And, you know, I have like one example, the town of Jacksonville, Illinois, right? In 1830, Jacksonville, Illinois, which was the largest town in Illinois at that time, had 446 residents. But those 446 residents, virtually every one of them was receiving at least one periodical in the mail. 89 of them were receiving 2, and that didn't. And those were only papers from out of town. That didn't include the papers that were being published within the town. So that basically Americans read newspapers constantly because the government was subsidizing the delivery of the newspapers, and they were doing it because our founders said that the widest possible dissemination of news and information is vital to the preservation of the republic. So there was a government policy that said the people need to have news, and it should be local news, and it should be subsidized news. Very different from the market advocates of today who say keep the government out, let us handle the internet, and we'll assure that the public gets the news and information it needs.
Statistic to that, by the end of the 1700s, within a 10-year period, the number of newspapers climbed from about 90 to 200, around 200, 230. By 1830, it was 1,400 newspapers. That shows you what postal policy did to really grow newspapers as a country, to allow for the creation of newspapers in cities throughout the country and local towns. So.
And that's why you have, for instance, before the Civil War, there were close to 100 Hispanic newspapers in the United States. Before the Civil War, yeah. The city of New Orleans alone had 25 Spanish-language newspapers, including a daily. That was a result of the government-subsidized postal policies that made it very easy, if you could print a paper, to get it delivered. So that there was a fostering of local press and local information. But that, of course, changed dramatically in the late 19th century with the development of the telegraph.
We're going to get to that after this break. And I want to talk about Ida B. Wells and Ruben Salazar and where we are today with the Internet and the battle over who controls the Internet. Our guests are Juan González, usually here interviewing others on Democracy Now!, but today with Joe Torres, talking about their new epic work, News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. This is Democracy Now! If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. We'll be back with Juan and Joe in a minute.